Joining us now, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, the New York Times national religion correspondent Elizabeth Dias, and the Washington Post senior national political correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Ashley Parker. Ashley, I want to start with you and the Biden team. They are trying increasingly every day to make sure that the issue of reproductive rights, which now encompasses not just abortion, but pregnancy, is front and center for American voters. Who specifically do they think that they can convince that this is the issue, the number one issue that they should vote on come November?
Well, they believe there's a number of people they can convince on this issue, in part because they look back at just about every election since the Dobbs decision, including elections they were not supposed to win, and how the issue of reproductive rights proved a galvanizing force. But of course, some of those key groups are the ones you named, are women, are young voters. And one of the ways you're doing this, and you mentioned this in your intro, but they're highlighting these stories that sort of, regardless of just about anyone's viewpoint, are devastating stories of women who have been affected by this, women who had wanted pregnancies, and, you know, were miscarrying, women whose health was at risk, women who were raped by a relative or a step-parent. And they're really making these women especially the face of this fight, in part because their stories are so devastating, so heartbreaking, and they hope, with all these groups I just mentioned, so compelling.
So what does that look like? You're talking about the women, the examples that they have, Ashley. How are they rolling that out?
Well, you've seen some ads. The First Lady is going to be campaigning with a young woman who appeared in a very compelling ad, I believe it was in Kentucky, talking about how she was raped and became pregnant by her stepfather when she was just 12 years old. She ended up miscarrying, but she's talking about the people who would take away reproductive freedom. She says, don't know what it's like to have stood in my shoes. So that's just one example, but you're going to see these women out on the campaign trail. You're going to see these women in ads, and you're going to see these women's stories recounted in speech after speech by the president, the vice president, and a number of Democratic surrogates.
We have a little bit of another ad. Let's play it.
Roe is just the beginning. They're going to try to ban the right to choose nationwide. They're coming for IVF and birth control next. We're up against extremism. Send me back to the White House and I'll fight like hell to restore Roe v. Wade and protect American freedom.
Elizabeth, can you give us a little bit of background on how we got to this point? I mean, you have a new book out. It's called The Fall of Roe. And you talk about how liberals were blindsided by the overturning of Roe v. Wade. How did we get to this point now, 2 years after?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of remarkable thinking about everything that so many Americans didn't see that had been happening for so many years that got us to the fall of Roe. And really, there was an elite network of conservative, mostly Christian lawyers, lobbyists, activists who worked together behind radars to create a legislation to Supreme Court pipeline, basically, to put all of the pieces in place to be able to pull the levers of power that they needed to create what would be cultural change. It's easy to think about cultural change happening first, right, from a majority and that trickling down into our politics. But what the fall of Roe showed is that the opposite can be true. And in this case, we have a conservative Christian minority where rolling back or ending abortion rights is an ultimate goal. But not just that, it's really about rolling back the entire sexual revolution and changing American culture by changing the law. So you start to see this influence not just in abortion now 2 years later, but issues like IVF, like you mentioned, some forms of contraception, and even things like putting the 10 Commandments in every school classroom in public schools in Louisiana.
What was Donald Trump's role while he was in office? And what might his role be if he regains office again?
Well, certainly we wouldn't probably be in this spot if Trump had not been president and had those 3 opportunities to put in Supreme Court justices. But more than that, even, or in addition to that, he really elevated a narrative of Christian grievance and promised conservative Christians. We hear this happening on the campaign trail, even now, promising conservative Christians that they would have power if he's in office and that their values would be placed on the mainstream. So even though we see him sort of backing away from all of his work to end abortion rights and overturn Roe, we also hear him speaking to groups like the Southern Baptist Convention, and specifically there, a group of anti-abortion activists who want the complete abolition of abortion at conception and have very hard right views. And some of those people went on to push to get the convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., to have their members vote to oppose IVF just a couple of weeks ago. So it's very likely, if you look at the past and see what those in his administration have done and who his supporters are, that these values will continue to be on the line.
So is he, Vaughn, now trying to embrace what he's done? Is he trying, I mean, Elizabeth remarked about how he's kind of starting to back off from it. Is he really? What exactly is the Trump team doing on the issue of abortion?
2 things to that. Number one, for months now, Donald Trump has hailed the Supreme Court justices who he nominated to the bench, those who overturned Roe v. Wade. He's hailed the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and he's taking credit for it. But part of that is also him trying to win over and curry favor with those Supreme Court justices for other issues that they are considering related to him. But just take today, the anniversary, for instance. We have not heard a single word from Donald Trump or his campaign about the Dobbs decision. Zero, nothing, no word whatsoever here. And I think that that's notable because they understand where the polling and where the political ramifications are. They saw it arguably in several of the battleground states in the 2022 midterms. And just take, when you're talking about Donald Trump in this issue, back in April, he had suggested that within a week he'd be coming out with a policy position on abortion medication. That was back in April. He hasn't come out with any position. He's been asked about the Comstock Act, which is an 1870 law that makes it illegal, that the DOJ has not prosecuted under the Biden administration, but makes it illegal to, through the mail, send abortion medication. And so there's a question whether his administration would seek to use the Department of Justice to prosecute such efforts. And so that is where some of the questions have just unanswered by this general election candidate 4 months out.
I have another question about where he stands on an issue that he's going to have to actually vote on himself in Florida. But first, let's play some sound from Republican women from over the weekend talking about how Donald Trump feels, how they feel about Donald Trump's flip-flopping position on abortion. Let's play it.
Some of us in our group, are torn on Trump, which is why half our group is here and half is not. Because of his comments regarding abortion, we want a federal abortion ban, and obviously he wouldn't support something like that. But we're hopeful that if he surrounds himself with the right people, and because he has been the most pro-life president, in our lifetime, a lot of us are still supporting him because of that.
I'm very disappointed with his position. It's something that it's very disheartening. There isn't a candidate that's currently one of the mainstream parties that is 100% anti-abortion, and that's really what I would look for in a presidential candidate.
So the first woman was talking about wanting to see him change on the issue. There is a question that will be posed to him, potentially at the debate, but at the ballot box come November, which would illuminate his true position on the issue of abortion. What is that question?
Right. In Florida, under Governor DeSantis, they passed an abortion ban, and now the voters of Florida are going to have on their ballot in November a measure that codifies protections for reproductive rights. And Donald Trump has been asked about this, and he has equivocated. He has not answered the question. And so while Donald Trump often dismisses questions or kind of equivocates on whether he'd sign a federal abortion ban, saying that he wanted to go to the states as a state's decision, Donald Trump himself is going to have that question asked of him as a Florida resident. And at this point in time, 4 months from the general election, he has not answered how he will vote on that measure.
So we heard from those women who were saying that there are conservative women among them who didn't show up because Donald Trump is not conservative enough on the issue, doesn't publicly support a federal abortion ban, or they believe he hasn't done so yet. There are also more centrist women. Elizabeth, you've done some reporting on this. Republican women who are divided on the issue of abortion, who believe in abortion more and abortion rights more than their counterparts in the Republican Party. Ashley, I want to ask you this question. This is the double haters, the people who don't feel at home in either party. And I'm assuming that some of those, there's some overlap there. The issue of abortion, how high does that rank for people who don't like either candidate?
So what's fascinating is I was just in Western Wisconsin talking to more than 60 of these double hater voters for a handful of days last month. And when I was going back through my notes trying to synthesize what I had heard, I realized none of them had brought up abortion at all. So that doesn't mean, as the polling shows, that it's not an issue for a number of people, but among this group, and at least in this place, and these 60 who I talked to, they did bring up policy issues. But the policy issues they mainly brought up were in reference to what they didn't like about President Biden, and it was the economy, number one, and the Israel-Gaza war, number two. What they didn't like about Trump had very little to do with policy. It was who he is as a person and his behavior. But I was also kind of stunned that abortion never once came up.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.